The emergency klaxons were screaming again, which meant either the coffee machine had finally achieved sentience and was staging a rebellion, or another mining accident had just flooded Luna Station Medical Center with casualties. Dr. Sarah Mitchell really hoped it was the coffee machine. Incoming trauma shuttle, ETA 3 minutes, announced the station's AI in its perpetually cheerful voice that somehow made every crisis sound like a dinner invitation. Multiple casualties from Sector 7 mining operations. Atmospheric breach, explosive decompression, and various impact injuries. Sarah sighed and pulled her auburn hair back into a surgical knot, mentally preparing for another 16-hour shift. 6 months of working the trauma center on humanity's primary lunar facility had taught her that miners had an almost supernatural ability to find new and creative ways to injure themselves in the depths of space. Dr. Mitchell. The voice belonged to Zara, her Cathani medical assistant, whose silvery skin caught the harsh fluorescent lighting in a way that made her seem almost ethereal. Like all of her species, Zara stood nearly 2 meters tall with elongated limbs that moved with mechanical precision, and ears that came to elegant points that twitched slightly when she was concentrating. "Let me guess," Sarah said, checking her instruments. "Crushed limbs, oxygen deprivation, and at least one idiot who thought he could outrun a pressure wave?" "Affirmative. Also, there appears to be a juvenile among the casualties." Zara's violet eyes showed no emotion as she reported this, her voice maintaining the same clinical tone she used for inventory reports. The trauma bay doors burst open, and chaos flooded in on repulsors. Sarah counted 8 patients, but her attention immediately went to the small figure on the central gurney. A boy who couldn't be more than 10 years old, his face blue-tinged from oxygen deprivation and his eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from watching adults panic. "What's a kid doing in a mining sector?" Sarah demanded, already moving to assess his condition. "Bring your child to work day," one of the paramedics replied grimly. "Father's over there with the crushed leg. Kid got caught in the same pressure wave." Sarah's hands moved automatically through triage protocols while her mind catalogued injuries and prioritized treatments. The boy's vitals were stable but weak, and she could see the classic signs of rapid decompression syndrome. Beside her, Zara worked with the same mechanical efficiency her species was famous for, her long fingers dancing over instruments with inhuman precision. But then something unexpected happened. As Sarah focused on the adult casualties, she noticed Zara doing something that went far beyond standard medical protocol. The Cathani was speaking softly to the frightened child, her voice losing its clinical edge and becoming almost musical. More surprisingly, she had somehow procured a small holographic projector and was creating gentle patterns of light that danced above the boy's head, distracting him from the medical procedures. "The lights are pretty," the child whispered, his breathing becoming less labored as Zara's treatment took effect. "They are star patterns from my home world," Zara replied, and Sarah heard something in her voice she'd never detected before, warmth. "Each one tells a story about brave children who became heroes among the stars." For the next 4 hours, Sarah watched Zara work with a level of care that went far beyond her programmed responses. When the boy's father woke up and began panicking about his son's condition, Zara somehow managed to be in 3 places at once. Monitoring the child's recovery, updating the father on his own treatment, and coordinating with the surgical team, all while maintaining that gentle, almost maternal presence. It was during a brief lull in the chaos that the words slipped out. Sarah was updating patient charts when she looked over at Zara, who was adjusting the boy's blanket with hands that moved like she was handling something infinitely precious. "You're really kind, you know that." Zara froze. Not the brief pause of someone processing information, but a complete stillness that seemed to encompass her entire being. When she turned to face Sarah, her violet eyes held an expression of such profound shock that Sarah wondered if she'd accidentally insulted her somehow. "Kind." Zara repeated the word as if she'd never heard it before, testing it like foreign syllables on her tongue. "Yes, kind. The way you handled that scared kid, the stories, the lights, that wasn't in any medical manual I've read." For a long moment, Zara simply stared at her, and Sarah began to worry that she'd somehow violated some Cathani cultural taboo. But then something extraordinary happened. A smile spread across Zara's features, not the professional expression she wore when dealing with patients, but something fragile and genuine and heartbreakingly tentative. "No one has ever used that word for me," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying a note of wonder that made Sarah's chest tighten. "In all my cycles of existence, through all my training and service, no being has ever called me kind." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "What do they call you?" "Efficient. Precise. Adequate." Zara's long fingers twisted together, a gesture so unconsciously human that it was jarring coming from someone who usually moved with mechanical perfection. "My supervisors have noted that I perform within acceptable parameters for interaction with lesser species." "Lesser species?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Is that what they call us?" Zara's pointed ears drooped slightly. "I should not have said that. It is not my place to question the classifications of my superiors." Before Sarah could respond, the emergency klaxons sounded again. Another shuttle was incoming, this one carrying casualties from a reactor accident on the far side of the station. As they moved to prepare for the new arrivals, Sarah caught Zara touching her own cheek where her smile had been, as if trying to preserve the memory of an unfamiliar sensation. "Zara?" Sarah called as the trauma bay doors opened again. "Yes, Dr. Mitchell. For what it's worth, I think kind is the best thing anyone can be in this job." The smile that bloomed across Zara's features was like watching sunrise on an alien world, unexpected, beautiful, and absolutely transformative. 3 weeks after what Sarah had privately dubbed the smile incident, she found herself paying closer attention to her alien colleague. It wasn't intentional, Sarah prided herself on maintaining professional boundaries, but there was something about the way Zara moved through the medical center that had begun to fascinate her. During quiet moments between emergencies, Sarah noticed how Zara's clinical facade would slip when she thought no one was watching. A gentle touch on an elderly patient's shoulder, an extra blanket tucked around a shivering accident victim, the way she always seemed to know exactly which injured person needed reassurance most. It was as if Zara had two completely different operating systems, and the compassionate one only emerged when her supervisors weren't monitoring. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said during their break, settling into the small alcove that served as the trauma center's break room. The view through the transparent aluminum showed Earth hanging in the star-filled void, a blue marble that never failed to make Sarah feel simultaneously homesick and grateful. Zara's violet eyes flickered with something that might have been nervousness. "I am not certain I understand the concept of personal, as humans define it." "Fair point. Let me rephrase. Can I ask you something about yourself that isn't medical related?" "I suppose that would be acceptable." Zara settled into the chair across from Sarah, her movements still precise but somehow less rigid than usual. "Where did you learn to tell stories?" "The star patterns you showed that kid, those weren't standard medical comfort protocols." Zara's pointed ears twitched, and she was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she'd overstepped some cultural boundary. When Zara finally spoke, her voice carried a quality Sarah had never heard before, something soft and almost nostalgic. "There was a caretaker in my youth facility. She was different from the others. While the instructors taught us anatomical structures and chemical compositions, she would sometimes speak of the old stories, the myths our people told before we became so efficient." Zara's fingers traced patterns on the table surface. "She said that healing was more than repairing biological systems, that sometimes the spirit needed tending as well." "What happened to her?" "She was reassigned for introducing non-standardized elements into our education." Zara's expression grew distant. "I was told that her methods were contaminating our development, making us less suitable for proper medical service." Sarah felt anger building in her chest. "Less suitable how?" "We began to care about our patients beyond their medical needs. This was deemed inefficient and potentially harmful to our objectivity." Zara looked up at Sarah, and for the first time, her carefully controlled expression cracked completely. I was 9 cycles old when they removed her from our facility. I cried for 7 days, which resulted in additional corrective training to suppress such responses. They punished you for crying? Emotional responses serve no function in medical treatment. They compromise judgment and reduce efficiency. I was taught to process patient deaths as data points rather than personal losses. Zara's voice had taken on the mechanical quality Sarah recognized from her earliest days working with her, but now she could hear the effort it took to maintain that tone. But you still tell stories. You still care. Zara's laugh was bitter. A persistent malfunction, according to my supervisors. It is why I was assigned to work with humans rather than my own species. You are considered less sophisticated in your medical practices, more tolerant of emotional irregularities. Sarah set down her coffee with more force than necessary. Emotional irregularities? You mean empathy? Compassion? The things that make someone a good healer instead of just a biological technician. Those are human concepts, Zara replied, but her voice lacked conviction. My people measure success by patient survival rates and treatment efficiency. And what do you measure success by? The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched Zara struggle with something she'd clearly never been asked to consider. Her violet eyes searched Sarah's face as if looking for clues to a puzzle she'd never been taught to solve. When that child stopped being afraid, when his father smiled upon hearing his son would recover completely, when you called me. Zara paused, the word hanging unspoken between them. Kind, Sarah supplied gently. Yes. When you used that word, I felt something I had never experienced before. A warmth that had nothing to do with thermal regulation, a satisfaction that transcended mere completion of assigned tasks. Zara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Is this what humans call happiness? Before Sarah could answer, the break room door chimed, and both women looked up to see a figure that made Zara instantly revert to her mechanical posture. The being in the doorway was clearly Cathani, but where Zara moved with fluid grace despite her precision, this newcomer seemed carved from cold metal. His silver skin had a polished quality that reflected light without warmth, and his violet eyes held no trace of the gentle curiosity Sarah had grown to love in Zara's gaze. Medical Assistant 47 Zara, the newcomer said, his voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. I am Inspector Thek, here to conduct your quarterly evaluation. You will report for assessment in Processing Bay 3 immediately. Yes, Inspector, Zara replied, and Sarah watched in dismay as every trace of warmth vanished from her colleague's demeanor. I shall complete current patient monitoring protocols and report within the standard time frame. See that you do. I have reviewed concerning reports about your methods during this assignment. Thek's gaze flicked dismissively over Sarah. We will discuss the extent of human contamination in your responses and determine appropriate corrective measures. After he left, Zara sat frozen in her chair, staring at the space where Thek had stood. Sarah reached across the table and gently touched her hand, surprised by how cold her silver skin had become. Zara, what's corrective measures? They will recalibrate my emotional responses to acceptable levels, Zara said, her voice so flat it was barely recognizable. Standard procedure when a medical assistant shows signs of excessive attachment to patients or colleagues. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What does that mean, exactly? They will adjust my neural pathways to eliminate the irregularities that cause me to experience inappropriate emotional responses. I will return to optimal functionality. Zara finally looked at Sarah, and her eyes held a depth of sorrow that made Sarah's heart break. I will no longer be the person you called kind. The medical bay's emergency alarm chose that moment to sound, calling them back to duty. As Zara stood and walked toward the trauma center with her usual mechanical precision, Sarah realized she was about to lose someone who had become far more important to her than she'd ever intended to admit. Inspector Thek's presence in the medical center was like a dark cloud that drained color from everything around it. For 3 days, he shadowed Zara's every movement, recording her interactions with patients and making notes on a device that hummed with disapproval every time she showed the slightest trace of empathy. Sarah watched helplessly as Zara transformed back into the mechanical being she'd first met 6 months ago. Gone were the gentle touches, the reassuring words, the intuitive understanding of what each patient needed beyond medical treatment. In their place was a cold efficiency that technically perfect but utterly soulless. Patient exhibits standard trauma responses to atmospheric exposure, Zara reported to Thek as they treated a construction worker who'd been caught in a hull breach. Her voice carried no warmth, no recognition that the patient was a terrified young man named David who kept asking if his girlfriend had been notified of the accident. Adequate assessment, Thek replied, his violet eyes recording every detail. Your previous reports for similar cases included irrelevant emotional data. This improvement is noted. Sarah bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. The irrelevant emotional data had been Zara's careful notation of which patients needed extra psychological support, which families required gentle handling of bad news, which recovery plans needed adjustment based on individual personality factors. All the things that made the difference between treating a medical condition and healing a person. Dr. Mitchell, Thek addressed her without looking up from his scanner. Your species' approach to medical care is primitive, but efficient enough for your limitations. However, I have noted concerning patterns in Medical Assistant 47, Zara's behavioral modifications since her assignment here. What kind of patterns? Sarah asked, though she was pretty sure she didn't want to hear the answer. Excessive emotional engagement with patients. Deviation from established protocols to accommodate individual psychological needs. Most concerning, the development of what appears to be personal attachment to colleagues. Thek's gaze finally fixed on Sarah, and she felt like she was being dissected by lasers. You have contaminated her programming with your species' emotional instability. I've helped her become a better healer, Sarah shot back, her anger finally overriding her diplomacy. Impossible. Healing is the restoration of biological function to optimal parameters. Emotional responses only compromise clinical judgment and reduce efficiency. Thek turned back to Zara, who stood statue still beside the patient's bed. Medical Assistant 47 Zara, you will accompany me to Processing Bay 3 for immediate recalibration. Your contamination levels have exceeded acceptable thresholds. Wait, Sarah said, stepping between Thek and Zara. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's the best medical professional I've ever worked with. That is precisely the problem, Thek replied coldly. She is not supposed to be good in human terms. She is supposed to be functional. The trauma bay alarm sounded, interrupting their confrontation. Emergency transport incoming, critical injuries from a reactor accident in Sector 12. Sarah looked at the incoming data and felt her stomach drop. Massive radiation exposure, third-degree burns, and catastrophic internal injuries. This was the kind of case that would require every skill they had, both technical and intuitive. All non-essential personnel clear the trauma bay, Sarah announced, but Thek didn't move. I will observe Medical Assistant 47, Zara's performance during this crisis to complete my evaluation, he stated. The patient who came through the doors was barely recognizable as human. Engineer Lisa Chen had been caught in the reactor room when a coolant line ruptured, exposing her to levels of radiation that should have been instantly fatal. Her burns covered 80% of her body, her organs were shutting down, and her neural activity was erratic from radiation damage to her brain. Prognosis is terminal, Thek announced after scanning her condition. Standard protocol would be to provide palliative care and allow natural expiration. Like hell, Sarah muttered, already prepping for emergency surgery. Zara, I need you to monitor her neural function while I work on the organ damage. Her brain activity is all over the place, but there might be patterns we can use to guide treatment. Zara hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Thek. The inspector's expression made it clear that any deviation from his recommendation would be noted and punished. Medical Assistant 47 Zara will follow established protocols, Thek said firmly. Heroic measures are not cost-effective for this level of damage. That's when something inside Sarah snapped. She looked at the dying woman on the table, at Zara's anguished expression, at Thek's cold indifference, and made a decision that would change everything. Inspector Thek, with all due respect, you can take your protocols and shove them out the nearest airlock. Sarah's voice carried through the trauma bay like thunder. Zara, I need you to make a choice. You can follow his orders and watch a brilliant engineer die because it's cost-effective, or you can help me save her life because it's the right thing to do. Dr. Mitchell, Thek's voice carried warning harmonics that made the medical equipment resonate. You are interfering with official Cathani procedures. And you're interfering with my patient care, Sarah shot back. This is a human medical facility treating a human patient. Your jurisdiction ends where my operating table begins. Zara stood frozen between them, her violet eyes wide with something that looked like terror. Sarah could see the war playing out across her features, cycles of conditioning battling against everything she'd learned about what it meant to truly heal. Choose, Zara, Sarah said softly. Who do you want to be? For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Zara didn't move. Then, with movements that seemed to cause her physical pain, she stepped toward the patient and placed her hands on the neural monitoring interface. I am detecting highly irregular but potentially viable brain patterns, she announced, her voice shaking. The patient's neural matrix is adapting to the radiation damage in ways that suggest natural resistance factors. With proper support, recovery may be possible. Thek's expression turned murderous. You are malfunctioning, Medical Assistant 47 Zara. Step away from the patient immediately. No, Zara said, and the words seemed to surprise her as much as everyone else. Dr. Mitchell is correct. This patient can be saved. I will not allow her to die for the sake of statistical efficiency. What followed was the most intense surgical procedure of Sarah's career. While Thek documented every violation of Cathani protocol, Sarah and Zara worked together with a synchronization that bordered on telepathic. Zara's intuitive understanding of the patient's neural patterns guided Sarah's hands as she repaired damage that should have been irreversible, while Sarah's surgical skill gave form to Zara's compassionate insights. 6 hours later, Engineer Chen's vital signs stabilized. Her neural activity normalized, her organs began functioning again, and her burns started showing signs of healthy tissue regeneration. She would live, and more importantly, she would recover completely. Impossible, Thek breathed, staring at the readings. No, Zara said, her voice stronger than Sarah had ever heard it. Just kind. Thek's response was swift and final. Medical Assistant 47 Zara, you are hereby declared defective beyond repair. You will return to Cathani space immediately for decommissioning and replacement. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. Decommissioning? Her neural pathways will be completely wiped and rebuilt from base programming, Thek explained with clinical detachment. The consciousness currently designated as Zara will cease to exist. In the silence that followed, Sarah heard Zara whisper something so quietly she almost missed it, I request political asylum. The trauma bay went dead quiet except for the steady beeping of Chen's life support monitors, a sound that proved what kindness could accomplish when it refused to be silenced. The Luna Station Administrative Center had never hosted an interspecies asylum hearing before, which meant nobody was quite sure what protocols to follow. The hearing chamber, normally used for cargo disputes and mining claim arbitrations, had been hastily converted into something resembling a courtroom, complete with translation matrices and diplomatic immunity fields. Sarah sat in the witness section, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 3 weeks had passed since Zara's asylum request, and the legal proceedings had drawn attention from across the solar system. News feeds carried headlines like Alien Nurse Seeks Human Protection and Medical AI Claims Right to Emotions, though none of them quite captured the truth of what was happening. Zara sat at the defendant's table with her court-appointed human advocate, a sharp-eyed lawyer named Janet Foster who specialized in synthetic rights cases. Despite everything she'd been through, Zara maintained her composure, though Sarah could see the stress in the slight tremor of her pointed ears and the way her silver skin had lost some of its natural luminescence. Across the chamber, Inspector Thek represented the Cathani position with cold authority, flanked by diplomatic officials whose expressions suggested they viewed the entire proceeding as a waste of time. To them, Zara wasn't a person seeking freedom, she was defective property that needed to be returned for proper disposal. The entity designated Medical Assistant 47 Zara is the property of the Cathani Medical Collective, Thek stated when called to present his case. Her neural pathways were constructed using proprietary biotechnology and programmed with specialized medical knowledge belonging to our civilization. Her current malfunction does not grant her legal personhood any more than a malfunctioning shuttle gains the right to refuse maintenance. Judge Patricia Adams, a no-nonsense administrator who'd been pulled from retirement to handle this unprecedented case, looked skeptical. Inspector Thek, are you claiming that all Cathani are property? All Cathani fulfill their designated functions within our society's structure, Thek replied carefully. The concept of individual desires conflicting with collective efficiency is foreign to our understanding. But not to hers, apparently, Judge Adams observed, nodding toward Zara. Ms. Foster, please present your case for the defendant. Janet Foster stood, her expression fierce with conviction. Your Honor, we're not here to debate the ownership of property. We're here to recognize the fundamental right of a sentient being to exist free from forced neural modification that would effectively constitute murder of her consciousness. She gestured toward Zara. The being we know as Zara has demonstrated clear self-awareness, emotional capacity, moral reasoning, and the ability to make independent ethical choices even when those choices conflict with her original programming. These are the hallmarks of personhood, regardless of her species' social structure. Foster called Sarah as her first witness, and Sarah found herself standing before an interstellar tribunal trying to explain something she barely understood herself. Dr. Mitchell, Foster began, please describe your professional relationship with the defendant. Sarah looked at Zara, drawing strength from those violet eyes that had watched her save so many lives. Zara isn't just my colleague. She's the most gifted healer I've ever worked with. She doesn't just treat symptoms, she sees the whole person, understands what they need not just medically but emotionally. She makes choices based on compassion, even when those choices go against established procedures. Can you give us a specific example? 3 weeks ago, we had a patient who was declared terminal by Cathani protocols. Inspector Thek wanted to provide palliative care and let her die. Zara chose to help me fight for that woman's life, even knowing it would result in her own punishment. That patient, Engineer Chen, made a complete recovery and returned to work last week. Foster nodded. In your medical opinion, what would happen to Zara if she undergoes the recalibration process described by Inspector Thek? Sarah's voice shook with barely controlled emotion. The Zara we know would cease to exist. They would preserve her technical knowledge while erasing everything that makes her who she is, her empathy, her intuition, her ability to connect with patients as individuals. It would be like performing a lobotomy on someone's soul. Thek's cross-examination was brutal and clinical. Dr. Mitchell, you admit that the entity's emotional responses have caused her to violate established medical protocols. I admit that her compassion has led her to make treatment decisions that prioritized patient welfare over bureaucratic efficiency. And these violations have compromised her reliability as a medical instrument. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. She's not an instrument. She's a person. And her so-called violations have saved lives that your protocols would have written off as acceptable losses. When Zara finally took the stand in her own defense, the courtroom fell silent. She moved with the same fluid grace Sarah remembered from their first meeting, but there was something different now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Medical Assistant 47 Zara, Foster began gently, please tell the court what you hope to achieve with this asylum request. Zara's voice was clear and steady. I wish to continue existing as the person I have become. I wish to heal others not because it is my programmed function, but because I choose to ease suffering wherever I find it. I wish to grow and learn and feel without fear that these experiences will be taken from me. And what does it mean to you to be called kind? For the first time since the hearing began, Zara smiled, that same fragile expression that had so moved Sarah months ago, now grown strong and sure. When Dr. Mitchell first used that word, I did not understand it. In my world, we are evaluated for efficiency, precision, compliance. But kindness is something different. It is the choice to care about another being's welfare even when logic suggests indifference would be more practical. She looked directly at Inspector Thek. I learned that the greatest medical interventions are not always the most efficient ones. Sometimes healing requires patience, intuition, and the willingness to fight for a patient even when statistics suggest failure. These are not malfunctions in my programming, they are evolutions in my understanding of what it means to truly serve life. Judge Adams took 3 hours to deliberate, during which Sarah paced the corridor outside the courtroom like an expectant father. When the judge finally returned, her expression was unreadable. This case has required me to grapple with questions that challenge our fundamental understanding of consciousness and personhood, Adams began. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony, I find that the being known as Zara has demonstrated clear criteria for individual sentience and autonomous moral reasoning. Sarah's heart stopped. Furthermore, the proposed recalibration process constitutes a form of forced mental modification that violates basic principles of personal autonomy. Therefore, I grant the defendant's request for asylum and recognize her right to refuse involuntary neural alteration. The courtroom erupted in chaos, but Sarah only had eyes for Zara, who sat frozen in her chair as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. When their eyes met across the room, Zara's smile was like watching a star being born. 6 months later, Dr. Zara Chen, she had chosen Sarah's surname in honor of the patient whose life had sparked her transformation, stood before a class of interspecies medical students at the newly established Luna Station Medical Academy. Her position as Director of Compassionate Care Integration was the first of its kind, bridging the gap between Cathani technical precision and human emotional intelligence. The question you must ask yourselves, she told her students, is not simply how to repair biological dysfunction, but how to heal the whole being, body, mind, and spirit. Medicine without compassion is merely maintenance. True healing requires us to see not just the injury, but the person who bears it. Sarah watched from the back of the lecture hall, remembering the cold, efficient assistant she'd first met and marveling at the transformation. After the class, as students filed out discussing their assignment on integrative healing techniques, Zara approached with that familiar gentle smile. Dr. Foster called today, Zara said. 15 more Cathani medical assistants have requested asylum hearings. The movement is spreading. Sarah grinned. Maybe your people will finally learn that feelings aren't a malfunction, they're a feature. Perhaps. Though I suspect it will take time for an entire civilization to unlearn cycles of conditioning. Zara's pointed ears tilted thoughtfully. But change begins with individual choices. One act of kindness at a time. As they walked together toward the medical center for their evening shift, Sarah reflected on how a single word had changed not just one person's life, but the trajectory of 2 species' understanding of what it meant to heal. The trauma bay would be busy tonight, it always was, but now she knew they would face whatever came with both technical expertise and compassionate hearts. You know, Sarah said as they passed a group of young medical students practicing bedside manner techniques, I never did thank you properly. For what? For teaching me that the best medicine isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about seeing what's already beautiful and helping it shine brighter. Zara's laugh was like wind chimes, and her smile carried all the warmth of someone who had finally learned that kindness wasn't weakness, but the strongest force in the universe.